Dr. Carol Rosen loved working late at the hospital. The 29-year-old pediatric resident would stay past midnight, comforting scared children and studying for her dream of opening a clinic back home in New York. On May 8, 1969, that gentle soul was found beaten to death in her Baltimore apartment. No forced entry, no theft, just brutal violence, and 53 years of silence. Baltimore police collected DNA evidence that sat useless in storage for decades. Then, in 2022, Detective Lisa Garner reopened the file. Using genetic genealogy, she traced fragments of genetic code through family trees across America. The trail led to James Howard McArthur, a quiet hospital orderly who had worked near Carol's rotation that fatal night. When confronted, the 76-year-old man confessed to the murder that had haunted a community for half a century. But just as justice seemed within reach, McArthur died in custody before trial. After 5 decades of waiting, was this really the end of Carol Rosen's story? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Rain drummed against the windows of University of Maryland Hospital as Dr. Carol Rosen began her morning rounds. The spring storm had started before dawn, turning Baltimore's streets into rivers of gray water. Inside the pediatric ward, she moved quietly between beds, checking on small patients who depended on her gentle touch. "How are you feeling today, Tommy?" she asked a 7-year-old boy with bandages covering his arm. The child had been burned in a kitchen accident 3 days earlier. His mother sat beside the bed, dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights. "It still hurts," Tommy whispered. Carol knelt beside his bed and pulled out a small flashlight shaped like a star. "This is a magic light," she said softly. "When you're scared, you can ask the nurse to turn it on. The star will chase away the scary thoughts." Tommy's eyes widened as the light cast tiny stars across the hospital room ceiling. For the first time since his accident, he smiled. Dr. Evelyn Marks watched from the doorway, admiring her young resident's way with children. Carol had arrived at the hospital just 18 months earlier, fresh from medical school but carrying wisdom beyond her years. She worked longer hours than required, stayed late to comfort frightened families, and never complained about the demanding schedule. "She's special," Dr. Marks had told her colleagues. "That girl will change the world of pediatric medicine." Carol stood up from Tommy's bedside and noticed the lease renewal notice tucked into her white coat pocket. Her apartment lease expired in 6 months. She'd planned to sign for another year, giving herself time to save money before moving back to New York to start her practice. The future felt bright and full of promise. As the morning shift continued, rain continued falling outside. Neither Carol nor anyone else in the hospital could know that in exactly 1 week, her light would go out forever. The evening of May 7th arrived with unusual warmth. The spring storm had finally moved through Baltimore, leaving the air fresh and clean. Carol finished her shift at the hospital around 10 o'clock, said goodnight to the night nurses, and walked the 8 blocks to her apartment building. Her small studio apartment sat on the 2nd floor of a converted brownstone in a quiet neighborhood near the hospital. She climbed the narrow stairs, key in hand, and let herself into the space she'd made her own. Medical textbooks lined the shelves, and her desk sat positioned near the window where natural light helped her study during the day. Carol made herself a cup of tea and settled at her desk with her pediatric medicine textbook. She was preparing for her boards, the final exam that would complete her residency. The pages contained detailed information about childhood diseases, treatment protocols, and the latest research in child development. As she read about new treatments for leukemia in children, Carol felt the weight of her calling. Every page represented a child who might be saved, a family who might avoid heartbreak. She imagined herself in 5 years, running her own practice, giving children in her hometown the same quality care she provided here in Baltimore. The apartment was quiet except for the soft scratch of her pen making notes in the margins. Her neighbors in the building were mostly young professionals like herself, nurses, teachers, social workers drawn to Baltimore by good jobs and affordable rent. The building felt safe. Everyone looked out for each other. Around 11:30, Mrs. Chen from the apartment next door later recalled hearing a soft knock at Carol's door. She didn't think much of it at the time. People visited each other in the building all the time. Sometimes the nurses from the hospital stopped by to borrow textbooks or share notes from conferences. Carol closed her textbook and turned off the lamp beside her desk. The light reflected briefly in the window, showing her face calm and content, unaware that her quiet evening was about to become her last. The knock came again, softer this time. Carol walked to the door and looked through the peephole. She recognized the person standing in the hallway and turned the deadbolt. The door opened, and James Howard McArthur stepped inside. Morning light streamed through the windows of University of Maryland Hospital as Dr. Evelyn Marks walked toward the pediatric ward. Carol should have arrived for her 6 o'clock shift 30 minutes ago. It wasn't like her to be late, especially not without calling. "Has anyone heard from Dr. Rosen?" she asked the charge nurse. "No. And I tried calling her apartment." No answer. Dr. Marks felt a flutter of concern. Carol was the most reliable resident she'd ever supervised. Something was wrong. "I'm going to check on her," Dr. Marks said. 20 minutes later, she stood outside Carol's apartment building with a security guard from the hospital. The landlord, Mr. Kozlov, met them at the front door with his master key, he said as they climbed the stairs. "Always pays rent on time, never any trouble." They reached Carol's door, and Mr. Kozlov knocked loudly. "Dr. Rosen? Are you all right?" Silence. He slipped the key into the lock and pushed open the door. Dr. Marks gasped and stepped backward. Carol lay motionless on the floor near her desk. Blood had dried around her head, and the lamp that usually sat on her desk lay shattered beside her body. She had been struck multiple times with the heavy base, the force of the blows evident in the damage to both the lamp and her skull. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Carol's purse sat untouched on the kitchen counter with $23 inside. Her jewelry box remained closed, her television and radio still in place. Dr. Marks backed into the hallway and told the security guard to call the police immediately. Within an hour, Baltimore police detectives swarmed the small apartment. Detective Ray Morrison led the investigation, carefully documenting every detail of the crime scene. The broken lamp pieces were bagged as evidence. The absence of forced entry puzzled him. Whoever did this had been let inside willingly. She knew her killer, Detective Morrison told his partner. No signs of struggle near the door. Looks like she was attacked while sitting at her desk, maybe reading. Under Carol's fingernails, the medical examiner found traces of skin and blood that didn't belong to her. In 1969, DNA testing didn't exist, so the biological evidence was carefully preserved, but couldn't provide immediate answers. Detective Morrison interviewed Carol's neighbors, but no one reported hearing sounds of a struggle. Mrs. Chen mentioned the soft knock she'd heard around 11:30, but couldn't describe the visitor. Whoever it was, she felt safe opening the door, Morrison noted in his report. The broken lamp told its own story. The heavy ceramic base had been used as a weapon, struck against Carol's head with enough force to kill her quickly. The violence seemed sudden and overwhelming, suggesting either rage or panic from the attacker. As crime scene technicians finished their work, Detective Morrison made a promise to the empty apartment. "We'll find who did this to you, Dr. Rosen." That's a promise. But promises and justice would prove to be different things entirely. Police headquarters buzzed with activity as detectives began the massive task of interviewing everyone connected to Dr. Carol Rosen's life. Detective Morrison and his team created lists of hospital staff, medical school friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have visited her apartment. The University of Maryland Hospital employed over 800 people in 1969. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, maintenance staff, cafeteria workers, security guards, all became potential suspects or witnesses. Detective Morrison set up interviews in a conference room, speaking with Carol's colleagues one by one. Dr. Evelyn Marks described Carol as dedicated and well-liked, with no known romantic relationships or personal conflicts. The other residents spoke highly of her, mentioning her habit of staying late to comfort children and their families. "Did she ever mention feeling unsafe or threatened?" Morrison asked each person. The answers were consistently no. Carol seemed to have no enemies. No ex-boyfriends causing problems, no disputes with fellow residents. James Howard McArthur's name appeared on the hospital employment roster as an orderly in the general maintenance department. He'd worked at the hospital for 2 years, performing basic cleaning and transport duties throughout the building. His supervisor described him as quiet and reliable, someone who showed up on time and did his job without complaint. "He's not much for conversation," the supervisor told Detective Morrison. "Keeps to himself mostly, but he's a good worker." McArthur lived alone in a small apartment about 3 miles from the hospital. When detectives knocked on his door for a routine interview, he answered calmly and invited them inside. His apartment was neat and sparse, with few personal belongings. "I heard about the doctor," he said when they explained their visit. "Terrible thing to happen to such a nice lady." "Did you know Dr. Rosen personally?" Morrison asked. "Not really. I might have seen her around the hospital, but we didn't work in the same areas much." McArthur's demeanor seemed normal to the detectives. He expressed appropriate shock about the murder and had no obvious connections to Carol beyond working at the same large hospital. His name was noted in the file, but he raised no particular suspicion. The autopsy report confirmed that Carol had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The broken lamp base matched the shape and size of her injuries perfectly. Time of death was estimated between 11:30 p.m. and midnight on May 7th. Most significantly, the medical examiner confirmed the presence of foreign biological material under Carol's fingernails, skin, and blood from her attacker. In 1969, this evidence couldn't identify a suspect, but it was carefully preserved in the hope that future technology might provide answers. Detective Morrison created a timeline of Carol's final evening. She'd left the hospital at 10 p.m., walked home alone, and been killed approximately 90 minutes later by someone she'd allowed into her apartment. The killer had used her own lamp as a weapon and left without taking anything of value. This wasn't a robbery, Morrison told his captain. This was personal, but we can't figure out what the motive could be. Days turned into weeks as the investigation continued. Police followed every lead, interviewed hundreds of people, and checked alibis for anyone with even a remote connection to Carol. But without modern forensic tools, the biological evidence remained useless, and no other clues emerged. The case began to grow cold as other murders demanded attention and resources. By 1970, Carol's file had been moved to the Unsolved Cases Division. Detective Morrison retired in 1985, still haunted by his failure to find Carol's killer. Before leaving the force, he updated her file one final time. Someday, he wrote, science will be able to tell us who killed Dr. Carol Rosen. When that day comes, this evidence will be waiting. The evidence vial containing skin and blood samples from Carol's fingernails sat in the Baltimore Police Evidence Storage Facility for 20 years. Technicians moved it periodically as storage systems were updated, but the biological material remained carefully preserved. In 1989, a young evidence technician named Patricia Wells noticed the old vial while reorganizing cold case materials. She'd heard about the new DNA profiling technology that was beginning to revolutionize criminal investigations. The Rosen case file noted the biological evidence, and Wells made sure it received proper long-term storage. This might be important someday, she told her supervisor. DNA profiling was still in its infancy in 1989. The technology existed, but remained expensive and time-consuming. Most police departments saved it for current cases with strong suspects, not 20-year-old cold cases with no leads. But Wells had a feeling about the Rosen case. She'd read through the file and been moved by Carol's story, a young doctor dedicated to healing children, killed by someone she trusted enough to let into her home. The senseless violence bothered Wells, and she made sure Carol's evidence received special attention. Television shows about unsolved mysteries were gaining popularity in the late 1980s. True crime became entertainment, as viewers fascinated themselves with cases like Carol's innocent victims, mysterious circumstances, and killers who seemed to vanish without a trace. The Rosen case occasionally appeared in local newspaper retrospectives about unsolved Baltimore murders. Each article brought a few phone calls to police with tips, but none led anywhere. Carol's killer had covered his tracks well and disappeared into normal life. Dr. Evelyn Marks, now chief of pediatrics at the hospital, never forgot her former resident. She kept Carol's photo in her office and mentioned her contributions during talks about women in medicine. Carol had died just as her career was beginning, but her dedication to children had inspired a generation of pediatric nurses and doctors. The biological evidence remained in storage, waiting for technology to catch up with justice. Patricia Wells checked on it regularly, making sure the samples remained viable for whatever scientific advances might come. Dr. Rosen deserves justice, Wells would tell new evidence technicians. Someday we'll have the tools to give it to her. That day was still far away, but it was coming. The new millennium brought significant advances in DNA technology and cold case investigation. The FBI created specialized units dedicated to reviewing unsolved murders, particularly those with biological evidence that could now be analyzed using techniques unavailable to previous generations of detectives. In 2005, Agent Thomas Riley arrived at the Baltimore Police Evidence Facility to review cold cases suitable for DNA analysis. He was part of a new federal initiative to solve older crimes using genetic evidence. His background in molecular biology made him ideal for the work of translating stored biological samples into criminal identifications. Carol Rosen's file caught his attention immediately. The 1969 murder had all the elements that made cold cases solvable: well-preserved biological evidence, detailed crime scene documentation, and a victim who seemed to have no enemies. The randomness of the crime suggested a perpetrator who might have committed other offenses, making DNA comparison especially valuable. This is exactly the type of case we can solve now, Riley told the Baltimore detectives. The evidence is good, and the documentation is excellent. If the killer is in any database, we'll find him. But budget constraints delayed the testing. Cold case DNA analysis was expensive, and departments had to prioritize current investigations over decades-old murders. Carol's case was approved for eventual testing, but joined a backlog of hundreds of similar cases waiting for funding and laboratory time. The delay frustrated Agent Riley, who understood that time was working against justice. Every year that passed meant witnesses died, suspects grew older, and families lost hope. But the technology was advancing rapidly, and Riley believed Carol's case would eventually reach the front of the line. Media coverage of DNA breakthroughs in cold cases created public interest in genetic genealogy. Families of murder victims began organizing advocacy groups, pressuring law enforcement to test old evidence and reopen forgotten investigations. The Golden State Killer case in California demonstrated the power of combining DNA evidence with genealogy databases. Investigators could now identify suspects through distant relatives who had uploaded their genetic profiles to public databases for family research purposes. Carol's case file was updated to reflect its priority status for future DNA testing. Agent Riley attached a note explaining the potential for genetic genealogy if direct database matches weren't found. The Rosen case represents the future of cold case investigation, he wrote. When we finally test this evidence, we'll have tools that Detective Morrison couldn't even imagine in 1969. 17 more years would pass before those tools were finally used. Detective Lisa Garner arrived at the Baltimore Police Cold Case Unit in January 2022 with a reputation for solving impossible cases. She'd worked homicide for 15 years and had developed expertise in genetic genealogy techniques that were revolutionizing cold case investigation. Her first week on the job, Garner reviewed priority cases that had been waiting years for proper DNA analysis. Carol Rosen's file stood out immediately, not just because of the well-preserved evidence, but because of the victim's story. A young doctor dedicated to healing children, killed by someone she trusted. The case embodied everything that motivated Garner to pursue justice for forgotten victims. "This one's going to the front of the line," she told her captain. Garner contacted the FBI lab at Quantico and requested expedited processing of the Rosen evidence. Agent Thomas Riley, now a senior genetic genealogist, remembered the case from his 2005 review and agreed to prioritize it. "I've been waiting 17 years to work this case," Riley told Garner. "Let's finally get justice for Dr. Rosen." The first step involved extracting viable DNA from the biological material under Carol's fingernails. Despite being 53 years old, the samples had been properly preserved and yielded enough genetic material for comprehensive analysis. The DNA profile showed a clear mixture: Carol's genetic material and that of an unknown male. The foreign DNA was submitted to CODIS, the National Criminal Database, but produced no matches. Carol's killer had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection. That's when genetic genealogy entered the investigation. Garner and Riley uploaded the suspect's DNA profile to GeneMatch, a public database where people shared genetic information to research family histories. The process was legal and had been approved by courts across the country for criminal investigations. The database search produced several distant genetic matches, people who shared small amounts of DNA with Carol's killer. None were close enough to be immediate family members, but they created a starting point for building a family tree that might lead to the suspect's identity. Riley began the painstaking process of analyzing genetic connections and building family trees. Working with genealogy specialist Dr. Sarah Chen, he traced DNA matches back through multiple generations, looking for common ancestors who might have produced both the people in the database and Carol's unknown killer. "We're looking for a needle in a haystack," Riley explained to Garner. "But genetic genealogy gives us a magnet." As winter turned to spring, in 2022, the investigation moved from police work to genetic detective work. Somewhere in the expanding family trees and DNA connections was the name of the man who had killed Carol Rosen 53 years earlier. In September 2022, Dr. Sarah Chen called Detective Garner with news that would change everything. "I think we found him," she said. Working through genealogy databases and public records, Chen had traced the suspect's DNA to a family tree that pointed to a specific individual, James Howard McArthur, age 76, residing in suburban Maryland, just 20 miles from where Carol had been murdered. Agent Riley confirmed Chen's analysis using independent databases. The genetic evidence was compelling. McArthur shared significant DNA markers with the biological material from Carol's fingernails, and his family tree aligned perfectly with the genealogy research. "The mathematics are clear," Riley told Garner. "This is our guy." Research into McArthur's background revealed the connection that had been invisible to 1969 investigators. He had worked as a hospital orderly at University of Maryland, during Carol's residency. Employment records showed he was on duty the night of May 7, 1969, working in areas of the hospital where Carol would have been present. McArthur had lived quietly in Maryland for 53 years since the murder. He'd married, raised children, and worked various jobs after leaving the hospital in 1971. To his neighbors and family, he was a quiet retiree who kept to himself and caused no trouble. The genetic genealogy breakthrough made headlines as one of the oldest cold cases solved using the technology. Maryland Attorney General's office praised the work as a model for future investigations. "This case demonstrates that justice has no expiration date," the Attorney General said at a press conference. "Science and persistence have given Dr. Rosen's family the answers they've waited 53 years to receive." But the real test would come when detectives confronted McArthur with the evidence against him. Detective Garner needed a legal DNA sample from James McArthur to confirm the genetic genealogy findings. Obtaining one required careful surveillance and legal collection of discarded material that contained his DNA. In October 2022, FBI agents followed McArthur during his daily routine. The 76-year-old man lived alone in a modest apartment complex, having lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. His children lived in other states and visited occasionally, but his daily life was solitary and predictable. Agents watched as McArthur visited a local coffee shop each morning around 8 o'clock. He ordered the same thing every day, black coffee and a plain donut, and sat at the same table reading the newspaper for exactly 30 minutes before walking home. On October 15th, Agent Riley sat 3 tables away as McArthur finished his coffee and left the shop. The discarded coffee cup went into the trash, and Riley retrieved it using proper evidence collection procedures. The DNA extracted from McArthur's saliva on the coffee cup was compared to the biological evidence from Carol's fingernails. The match was perfect, identical DNA profiles that proved James McArthur had been in physical contact with Carol Rosen during her murder. "It's him," Riley told Detective Garner. "53 years later, we have our killer." Neighbors were shocked to learn that the quiet man they'd known for years was suspected of murder. "He seemed so normal," said Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the apartment next to McArthur's. "He helped me carry groceries sometimes. I can't believe he could hurt anyone." The disconnect between McArthur's mild public demeanor and the brutal violence of Carol's murder highlighted how successfully some killers hide in plain sight. For half a century, he'd lived as a free man while Carol's family suffered without answers. Detective Garner prepared arrest and search warrants, knowing that confronting McArthur would be the culmination of decades of investigation and the beginning of justice for Carol Rosen. "We finally have him," she told Agent Riley. "After all these years, we can give Dr. Rosen's family the truth." The ethical implications of genetic genealogy sparked debates in legal and privacy circles, but most law enforcement professionals saw it as a powerful tool for solving cases that had seemed impossible. McArthur's identification represented both technological triumph and moral complexity. The arrest was scheduled for November 2022, more than 53 years after Carol's murder. On November 18, 2022, Detective Lisa Garner and Agent Thomas Riley arrived at James McArthur's apartment with arrest warrants and backup officers. McArthur answered his door, wearing a cardigan sweater and slippers, looking every bit the harmless elderly man his neighbors believed him to be. "James Howard McArthur, you're under arrest for the murder of Dr. Carol Rosen," Garner said, showing her badge. McArthur's face went pale, but he didn't resist. His hands shook as officers placed him in handcuffs and led him to the police car. Neighbors gathered in the parking lot, watching in disbelief as their quiet neighbor was arrested for a murder that had occurred before some of them were born. At police headquarters, McArthur was placed in an interview room with his attorney present. Despite his advanced age, he was mentally sharp and understood the charges against him. When Detective Garner explained the DNA evidence, his shoulders sagged. "I never thought you'd find out," he said quietly. For the first hour, McArthur denied involvement in Carol's death. He claimed never to have met her personally, despite working at the same hospital. But when shown crime scene photographs and the DNA comparison results, his composure cracked. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, tears forming in his eyes. "I just lost control." McArthur's confession came in fragments, delivered through sobs and long silences. He described going to Carol's apartment that night after his shift at the hospital. He'd seen her around the pediatric ward and developed what he called feelings for her. "She was always so kind to everyone," he said. "I thought maybe we could be friends." When Carol opened her door, McArthur had tried to express his attraction. When she politely rejected his advances and asked him to leave, something inside him snapped. The quiet, mild-mannered man became violent in an instant. "I grabbed the lamp and hit her," he confessed. "I hit her again and again. I couldn't stop myself. Detective Garner listened to the confession with professional calm, but inside she felt rage at the senseless destruction of Carol's life. A brilliant doctor had been murdered because she'd rejected the inappropriate advances of a hospital worker. After killing Carol, McArthur had simply left her apartment and walked home. He'd quit his job at the hospital 2 years later and never spoke of the crime to anyone. For 53 years, he'd carried the secret while Carol's family lived with unanswered questions. "Did you ever think about what you did to her family?" Garner asked. McArthur nodded slowly. "Every day, but I was too scared to confess. I thought if I just kept quiet, maybe I could forget." But he never forgot. The confession revealed that Carol's murder had haunted him for decades, filling him with guilt and shame that he'd never been able to escape. Online forums buzzed with discussions about McArthur's confession and the ethics of genetic genealogy. Some praised the technology for solving an impossible case, while others worried about privacy implications for innocent family members whose DNA had led to the identification. The confession was recorded and would serve as the primary evidence if McArthur lived long enough to stand trial. At 76 years old with declining health, there were questions about whether justice would finally be served in a courtroom. In March 2023, James Howard McArthur was formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Dr. Carol Rosen. The Baltimore County District Attorney announced the charges at a press conference, calling it one of Maryland's oldest cold cases solved through genetic genealogy. After 54 years, Dr. Rosen's family finally has answers, District Attorney Patricia Williams said. "While we cannot bring back their loved one, we can ensure that her killer faces justice." McArthur appeared in court, wearing an orange jumpsuit, looking frail and older than his 76 years. He entered a plea of not guilty, despite his confession to police. His defense attorney indicated they might argue diminished capacity due to his age and declining mental state. The case attracted national media attention as an example of how modern technology could solve decades-old crimes. True crime podcasters and television producers contacted the Rosen family for interviews, hoping to tell Carol's story to wider audiences. Margaret Rosen, Carol's younger sister, spoke publicly for the first time since the arrest. "We never gave up hope that someday we'd know what happened to Carol," she said. "She was going to be an amazing pediatrician. She loved children and wanted to heal them. Instead, her life was cut short by senseless violence." A candlelight vigil was held outside University of Maryland Hospital to honor Carol's memory. Current residents and nurses gathered to remember the young doctor whose dedication had inspired generations of medical professionals. Dr. Evelyn Marks, now retired but still sharp at 85, attended the vigil. "Carol would have saved thousands of children if she'd lived," Dr. Marks told the crowd. "Her murder robbed the world of a brilliant healer, but her memory continues to inspire those of us who care for children." The defense team prepared to argue that McArthur's advanced age and failing health made him unfit for trial. Medical evaluations would determine whether he was mentally competent to understand the proceedings against him. Prosecutors pushed for a quick trial, knowing that time was working against justice once again. After waiting 54 years for answers, Carol's family deserved to see her killer face judgment in court, but fate would intervene before the legal process could reach its conclusion. In April 2023, during a routine medical screening at the county detention center, James McArthur collapsed in his cell. Prison medics found him unconscious and transported him to Maryland General Hospital, where doctors diagnosed advanced lung cancer that had spread throughout his body. The cancer had likely been growing for months, but McArthur had ignored symptoms, perhaps hoping to avoid medical attention that might complicate his legal situation. Now the disease was terminal, with doctors estimating he had weeks rather than months to live. "Justice delayed is justice denied," said District Attorney Williams when informed of McArthur's condition. "We may not get our day in court, but we have his confession." Dr. Rosen's family has their answers. The news sparked debates about whether seriously ill defendants should be released from custody or tried immediately, despite their condition. Legal experts pointed out that McArthur had lived 54 years as a free man after committing murder, a luxury Carol Rosen had never enjoyed. Margaret Rosen visited the courthouse when informed about McArthur's diagnosis. "I wanted to see him face justice in a courtroom," she said. "But at least we know the truth now. At least Carol's story isn't a mystery anymore." Prosecutors worked quickly to preserve McArthur's confession for the historical record. They arranged for him to provide a detailed video statement from his hospital bed, ensuring his admission of guilt would be permanently documented even if he died before trial. In the video confession, recorded with his attorney present, McArthur appeared frail, but mentally coherent. He admitted to murdering Carol and expressed what seemed like genuine remorse. "I destroyed a beautiful life," he said, struggling to speak clearly. Dr. Rosen was a good person who helped children. I took that away from the world, and I'm sorry. The confession provided details that only Carol's killer could have known, confirming the DNA evidence and closing any remaining doubts about his guilt. Talk shows and legal commentators debated whether McArthur's impending death represented cosmic justice or another failure of the legal system. Some saw his terminal illness as appropriate punishment for escaping accountability for so many decades. Others argued that only a courtroom verdict could provide true justice for Carol and her family. The case highlighted broader questions about how society handles elderly defendants who commit crimes decades earlier. As DNA technology solves more cold cases, prosecutors increasingly face situations where suspects are too old or sick to face traditional consequences for their actions. "This isn't the ending we wanted," Detective Garner told reporters, "but it's the ending we got. Sometimes justice takes 50 years. And sometimes it arrives just as the guilty party is leaving this world." In May 2023, journalists and true crime researchers began reconstructing the timeline of Carol Rosen's final day, using hospital records and witness statements to create a complete picture of her last hours alive. The records showed that Carol had worked a particularly long shift on May 7, 1969, staying late to comfort a child recovering from surgery. McArthur was also on duty that evening, working in the general maintenance department, with access to most areas of the hospital. Security logs indicated that McArthur had signed out of the hospital at 10:15 p.m., just 15 minutes after Carol left for home. The timing suggested he might have followed her or arranged to meet her later. He knew her routine, Detective Garner explained to reporters. He'd observed her for weeks or months, learning when she worked and where she lived. This wasn't a random encounter. The hospital records revealed that McArthur had requested transfers to work areas closer to the pediatric ward several times in the months before Carol's murder. His supervisors had approved the transfers, thinking he was simply interested in different types of work. He was essentially stalking her within the hospital, said security expert Dr. Robert Chen. He used his position to get closer to his target without arousing suspicion. Renewed attention to workplace safety in hospitals emerged from Carol's case. Medical administrators reviewed security protocols for staff working late shifts, particularly young women who might be vulnerable to harassment or violence from colleagues. The case sparked discussions about the unique dangers faced by women in medicine during the late 1960s. Female doctors and nurses often worked alone in large hospitals with minimal security, making them vulnerable to violence from patients, visitors, or fellow staff members. Dr. Evelyn Marks spoke at medical conferences about the need for better protection of healthcare workers. Carol died because she was isolated and vulnerable, Dr. Marks said. "We've learned to do better, but her case reminds us that vigilance is eternal." Newspaper archives from 1969 were digitized and made available online, allowing researchers to study how Carol's murder had been covered at the time. The stories revealed community shock and fear, but also the limited investigative tools available to 1960s police departments. Detective Morrison's original case files, preserved in police archives, showed how thoroughly he had investigated, despite technological limitations. His careful evidence collection and detailed documentation had made the 2022 breakthrough possible. Detective Morrison did everything right with the tools he had, Agent Riley noted. He preserved the evidence that eventually solved the case. Carol got justice because he never gave up, even when the case went cold. The historical reconstruction of Carol's final day brought her back to life in the public imagination, transforming her from a cold case statistic into a real person whose death had meaning and consequences. In August 2023, the Rosen family received a comprehensive case summary and DNA analysis report from Baltimore police. The document provided scientific confirmation of everything they had suspected for 54 years, that Carol had been murdered by someone who knew her, someone she had trusted enough to admit to her apartment. Margaret Rosen, now 78 years old, read through the report with her children and grandchildren gathered around her kitchen table. The DNA evidence was conclusive and irrefutable. James McArthur's genetic material under Carol's fingernails proved he had been her killer. "We always knew someone had taken Carol from us," Margaret said, "but having the proof makes it real in a different way. We can finally stop wondering and start remembering her properly." The forensic chain of custody documentation showed how carefully the evidence had been preserved through 5 decades of storage. From Detective Morrison's initial collection in 1969 through the 2022 genetic genealogy analysis, the biological samples had maintained their integrity and scientific value. Dr. Sarah Chen, the genealogy specialist who had identified McArthur, provided the family with a detailed explanation of how genetic databases and family tree analysis had led to their answers. Your sister's case helped pioneer the use of this technology for cold case investigations, Dr. Chen told them. Her story will help solve other families' mysteries in the future. The family gave interviews to several true crime podcasts and television programs, sharing memories of Carol's life and dreams. They emphasized her dedication to healing children and her plans to return to New York to open a pediatric practice. Carol didn't just want to be a doctor, Margaret explained. She wanted to be the doctor that scared children could trust, the one who made hospitals feel safe instead of frightening. Forensic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, who had worked on other famous cold cases, called the Rosen investigation a model for future work. This case shows how careful evidence preservation and advanced genetic analysis can provide answers decades after traditional investigation methods have been exhausted, Ray Venter said. But the family's relief was tempered by the knowledge that McArthur would likely die before facing trial. Justice had been identified but not delivered in the way they had hoped for 54 years. We wanted to see him in court, Margaret said. We wanted a judge to say, officially, that he was guilty, but we're grateful to know the truth finally. The DNA report became a family heirloom, scientific proof that their decades of grief and questions had been justified. Carol had indeed been the victim of violence, and her killer had been identified through the persistence of science and the dedication of investigators who refused to forget her. In December 2023, Detective Lisa Garner presented the Rosen case at an FBI conference on genetic genealogy and cold case investigation. Law enforcement professionals from across the country attended her presentation, learning how modern techniques could solve seemingly impossible cases. The conference room was packed as Garner walked through the investigation timeline, from the 1969 crime scene to the 2022 genetic genealogy breakthrough. She emphasized the importance of careful evidence preservation and the partnership between local police and federal genetic specialists. This case took 54 years to solve, but it was worth the wait, Garner told the audience. Dr. Rosen's family finally has answers, and her killer has been identified. That's what we owe to every victim of unsolved crime. Agent Thomas Riley presented the technical aspects of the genetic genealogy work, showing how DNA matches in public databases had led to the construction of family trees that ultimately pointed to James McArthur. We confirmed the match through 3 independent genealogy databases, Riley explained. The science is solid, and the legal precedents support this type of investigation. The conference proceedings were published in academic journals, making the Rosen case a landmark study in cold case methodology. Criminology students would study the investigation for years to come, learning how persistence and technology could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Critics of genetic genealogy raised privacy concerns at the conference, arguing that the technique violated the consent of innocent family members whose DNA had been used to identify suspects. Supporters countered that solving violent crimes justified the investigative methods. We have a duty to victims and their families, said Dr. Margaret Johnson, a forensic geneticist from California. If public databases can help identify killers and rapists, we should use them responsibly. Garner addressed the ethical concerns in her presentation, noting that all genetic genealogy work in the Rosen case had been conducted within legal guidelines and with court approval. We followed every rule and respected every privacy protection, she said, but we also respected Dr. Rosen's right to justice and her family's right to answers. The conference generated media coverage that brought renewed attention to cold case investigation funding. Several states announced new initiatives to review unsolved murders using genetic genealogy techniques. As Garner packed up her presentation materials, she reflected on the strange satisfaction of solving a case that had occurred 27 years before she was born. Carol Rosen had been dead for 54 years, but her case had become Garner's personal mission. Every victim deserves a detective who won't give up, Garner said in her closing remarks. Dr. Rosen waited 54 years for justice. We couldn't let her wait any longer. On January 15, 2024, James Howard McArthur died quietly in his sleep at Maryland General Hospital. The 76-year-old man had been battling lung cancer for 9 months, growing progressively weaker as his body failed. His death came 3 weeks before his scheduled trial for Carol's murder. Prosecutors had been preparing their case, gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses, but the opportunity for courtroom justice died with McArthur. The news of his death sparked mixed reactions from the public and Carol's family. Some saw it as cosmic justice, a killer finally facing ultimate accountability after escaping earthly consequences for 55 years. Others viewed it as another failure of the legal system to provide proper closure. Margaret Rosen received the call about McArthur's death while having breakfast with her daughter. She set down her coffee cup and was quiet for several long minutes. "Part of me is relieved," she finally said, He can't hurt anyone else now. But part of me wanted to see him stand up in court and hear a judge say he was guilty. Before his death, McArthur had written a brief apology letter to the Rosen family. Prison staff debated whether to deliver it, ultimately deciding that the family had the right to decide whether to read his final words. The letter was simple and handwritten in shaky script. "I am sorry for what I did to Dr. Rosen. She was a good person who helped children. I destroyed her life and hurt your family. I wish I could take it back. I have lived with guilt every day for 55 years. I hope you can find peace now." Margaret Rosen read the letter once and put it away. She never read it again. Public opinion was divided on whether McArthur's apology letter meant anything after so many decades of silence. Some saw it as genuine remorse from a dying man facing final judgment. Others viewed it as too little, too late from someone who had lived freely while Carol's family suffered. Prison staff noted that McArthur had been a model prisoner during his brief incarceration, causing no trouble and expressing remorse to anyone who would listen. But his good behavior in custody couldn't undo the violence he had committed in 1969. The death certificate listed lung cancer as the primary cause of death, but some observers noted the irony that McArthur's body had begun failing shortly after his arrest. Whether guilt, stress, or simple coincidence had accelerated his illness would never be known. Detective Garner attended McArthur's brief funeral service, not out of respect for the defendant, but to ensure that the case was truly closed. Only a handful of people came to mourn him, distant relatives who had been shocked to learn of his crime. He lived 55 years longer than Dr. Rosen, Garner reflected. That's not justice, but it's all the justice we're going to get. In February 2024, the Baltimore Medical Examiner's Office released the official cause of death for James Howard McArthur. Advanced lung cancer with metastasis to multiple organs had caused his death, ending any possibility of a criminal trial for Carol Rosen's murder. District Attorney Patricia Williams held a press conference to address the conclusion of the case. Standing before a room full of reporters and cameras, she confirmed that McArthur's death had closed the legal proceedings, but not the moral questions raised by the investigation. James McArthur confessed to murdering Dr. Carol Rosen in 1969, Williams said. His death prevents a trial, but it doesn't change the facts. He was her killer, and that truth is now part of the historical record. Prosecutors released the complete transcript of McArthur's confession, allowing the public to read his detailed admission of guilt. The document provided closure for those who had followed the case and confirmation that genetic genealogy had identified the correct suspect. The confession transcript revealed additional details about the crime that hadn't been made public during the investigation. McArthur described his obsession with Carol, his decision to visit her apartment, and the moment when rejection triggered his violent response. "I thought she might like me," McArthur had told detectives. "When she said no and asked me to leave, something just snapped. I grabbed the lamp and hit her. I couldn't stop hitting her." Legal experts noted that the detailed confession, combined with DNA evidence, would have made conviction highly likely if McArthur had lived to stand trial. His death represented lost opportunity rather than legal uncertainty. Case closed headlines appeared in newspapers across the country as the media declared the Rosen murder officially solved. True crime podcasters and television producers created documentaries about the investigation, ensuring that Carol's story would reach audiences far beyond Baltimore. The case became a teaching tool for law enforcement academies and criminology programs. Students studied how careful evidence preservation in 1969 had enabled genetic genealogy breakthroughs in 2022, demonstrating the long-term value of thorough crime scene investigation. Critics continued to debate the ethics of genetic genealogy and the privacy implications of using family DNA to identify suspects, but supporters pointed to the Rosen case as proof that the technique could provide answers for families who had waited decades for justice. Margaret Rosen spoke at a victims' rights conference about the experience of finally learning her sister's killer's identity. "For 55 years, we wondered who had taken Carol from us," she said. "Now we know. That knowledge doesn't bring her back, but it brings a kind of peace we've never had before." The Baltimore Police Department officially classified the Rosen case as cleared by death of offender, the standard designation when a suspect dies. Before trial, the file was archived with a complete record of the investigation and its resolution. Detective Garner stamped the case folder with the final closure date and added it to the growing collection of cold cases solved through genetic genealogy. Each file represented years of suffering, ended by scientific breakthrough and investigative persistence. In March 2024, University of Maryland Hospital held a memorial service for Dr. Carol Rosen in the main auditorium where she had once attended medical lectures as a resident. Current staff, retired colleagues, and members of the community gathered to honor her memory and acknowledge the resolution of her murder case. Dr. Evelyn Marks, now 86, but still sharp, delivered the main address. She had worked with Carol for only 18 months in the late 1960s, but the young resident's impact had lasted a lifetime. Carol Rosen was going to change pediatric medicine. Dr. Marks told the audience. She had the intelligence, the compassion, and the dedication to heal thousands of children throughout her career. Her death robbed the world of a brilliant healer. A portrait of Carol was unveiled in the hospital's Hall of Honor, joining photos of other medical professionals who had made significant contributions to patient care. The plaque beneath her picture read, Dr. Carol Rosen, 1940-1969, pediatric resident, dedicated to healing children. Current residents and nurses spoke about how Carol's story had inspired their own commitment to patient care. Her dedication to working late to comfort frightened children had become legendary among hospital staff, passed down through generations of medical professionals. She shows us what it means to put patients first, said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, current chief of pediatrics. Even 55 years later, Dr. Rosen continues to teach us about compassion and dedication. Margaret Rosen attended the memorial service with her children and grandchildren. Seeing her sister honored by the medical community provided a sense of completion that the legal system had been unable to deliver. Carol always wanted to be remembered for helping children, Margaret said during the service. Today, she is. The memorial service was recorded and made available online, ensuring that Carol's story and contributions would be preserved for future generations of medical professionals. Her case had solved a murder, but her legacy was about healing and hope. Surgeons and nurses who had worked with Carol shared memories of her kindness and skill. They described a young doctor who arrived early, stayed late, and never seemed to lose patience with difficult patients or demanding families. She made the pediatric ward a better place, recalled retired nurse Sandra Mills. Children who were terrified of doctors would smile when Dr. Rosen walked into their rooms. The memorial service concluded with a moment of silence for Carol and all victims of unsolved crimes. The gesture acknowledged that while her case had been resolved, thousands of other families continued waiting for answers about their own loved ones. As attendees filed out of the auditorium, many stopped to look at Carol's portrait. Her smile seemed to embody the hope and dedication that had driven her to medicine, making her death all the more tragic, but her memory all the more precious. In April 2024, Detective Lisa Garner cleaned out her desk as she prepared for transfer to a new assignment in the Baltimore Police Department's homicide unit. The Rosen case had been her first major success in the cold case unit, and its resolution marked the end of one chapter in her career. Garner packed up files from dozens of other unsolved murders, each representing a family still waiting for answers. The genetic genealogy techniques that had solved Carol's case offered hope for many of these cold cases, but the work required time, funding, and the kind of well-preserved evidence that wasn't always available. Dr. Rosen was lucky, Garner told her replacement. She had a detective in 1969 who collected everything properly and an evidence technician who preserved it carefully. Not every victim has that kind of professional dedication working for them. The success of the Rosen investigation had brought Garner national recognition and job offers from other police departments. But she chose to stay in Baltimore, where her expertise in genetic genealogy could help solve other long-forgotten crimes. More than 100 cold cases in Baltimore contained biological evidence suitable for genetic genealogy analysis. Garner had created a priority list based on the quality of evidence, the completeness of case files, and the likelihood of identifying suspects through family DNA. Every one of these files represents a family that deserves answers, Garner said, looking at the stacks of unsolved cases. Dr. Rosen's family waited 55 years. Some of these families have been waiting even longer. The emotional toll of cold case work was evident in Garner's office, where photos of victims lined the walls like a gallery of the forgotten. Each face represented someone whose death had never been properly resolved, whose killer had escaped justice. But the Rosen case had demonstrated that time and technology could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. DNA that had been useless in 1969 had provided definitive answers in 2022. Evidence that had gathered dust for decades had become the key to solving one of Maryland's oldest mysteries. Garner's final act in the cold case unit was to update the Rosen file with a complete summary of the investigation and its resolution. Future investigators and researchers would be able to study every aspect of the case, from the original crime scene work to the genetic genealogy breakthrough. This case will teach people how to solve impossible crimes, she wrote in her final report. Dr. Rosen's death wasn't in vain if it helps us catch other killers who think they've gotten away with murder. The archive lights dimmed as Garner left the cold case unit for the last time. Behind her, dozens of unsolved murders waited for the same kind of scientific breakthrough and investigative persistence that had finally brought justice for Carol Rosen. In June 2024, Baltimore City Hall hosted a public forum on the ethics of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. The Rosen case had sparked community debate about privacy rights, investigative methods, and the balance between solving crimes and protecting citizens' genetic information. The forum brought together privacy advocates, victims' rights groups, law enforcement officials, and legal experts to discuss how genetic genealogy should be regulated and used in future investigations. Detective Garner spoke about the investigative value of the technology, emphasizing how it had provided answers for the Rosen family after 55 years of uncertainty. Without genetic genealogy, James McArthur would have taken his secret to the grave, Garner told the audience. Dr. Rosen's family would never have known who killed their sister. Privacy advocates raised concerns about the use of family members' DNA to identify suspects without their knowledge or consent. They argued that relatives who had submitted genetic information for genealogy research had never agreed to help solve crimes. People have a right to genetic privacy, said civil liberties attorney David Ross. Using their DNA to catch criminals, even violent criminals, crosses ethical lines. Victims' rights advocates countered that solving murders and bringing closure to families outweighed privacy concerns, especially when investigations followed legal guidelines and court oversight. Margaret Rosen spoke about her family's experience, describing the relief of finally knowing her sister's killer's identity after decades of questions and uncertainty. "We would have given anything to know the truth," she said. "If my DNA or my family's DNA could help solve another family's case, I would want it to be used." Lawmakers proposed new legislation, requiring clearer consent standards for genetic genealogy databases and stronger oversight of law enforcement use of family DNA. The proposed rules would balance investigative needs with privacy protections. The forum concluded without consensus, reflecting broader societal debates about technology, privacy, and justice in the digital age. But most participants agreed that cases like Carol's demonstrated both the promise and the complexity of genetic genealogy. Citizens voiced both fear and hope about the technology's implications. Some worried about surveillance and privacy violations, while others celebrated the possibility of solving long cold cases and bringing killers to justice. The applause that followed each speaker gradually faded into thoughtful reflection as attendees considered the difficult balance between individual rights and collective safety. The Rosen case had provided answers for one family, but it had raised new questions for society as a whole. In August 2024, a media retrospective documentary titled The Last Confession, Dr. Carol Rosen's Story, premiered on a major television network. The film combined archival footage, interviews with investigators, and family memories to tell the complete story of the 55-year journey from murder to resolution. The documentary opened with footage of Carol during her medical school graduation, showing her bright smile and obvious excitement about beginning her career in pediatric medicine. Her sister Margaret provided narration, describing Carol's dreams of opening a children's clinic and her dedication to healing sick children. Carol believed that being a doctor meant more than just treating symptoms. Margaret said in the film, she wanted to heal not just bodies, but hearts and spirits too. Dramatic recreations showed the 1969 crime scene investigation, with actors portraying Detective Morrison and his team collecting evidence that would remain useless for decades. The film emphasized how carefully the original investigators had worked despite technological limitations. Audio clips from Carol's final lecture to medical students had been discovered in university archives and included in the documentary. Her voice, preserved on old recording equipment, spoke passionately about the importance of compassion in pediatric medicine. "When you treat a child, you're not just treating a patient," Carol's recorded voice said. "You're treating a family's hope, a parent's fear, and a little person's trust in the world." Detective Garner and Agent Riley were interviewed extensively about the genetic genealogy breakthrough, explaining how modern technology had finally unlocked the secrets hidden in 55-year-old DNA samples. The documentary included footage from McArthur's confession, showing the frail old man admitting to the crime that had defined Carol's legacy. His words were difficult to hear, but they provided the closure that Carol's family had sought for more than 5 decades. Public sentiment, as measured by social media responses to the documentary, turned increasingly reverent toward Carol's memory. Viewers focused less on the crime details and more on her contributions to medicine and her dedication to healing children. "She would have saved so many lives," one viewer wrote. Her murder didn't just take one person, it took all the children she would have healed. The documentary's editors faced difficult decisions about balancing tragedy with triumph, ultimately choosing to end with scenes of current pediatric residents at University of Maryland Hospital, working in the tradition that Carol had helped establish. The film's final image was a slow fade from Carol's smiling graduation photo to her memorial plaque in the hospital hallway, suggesting that while her life had been cut short, her influence continued through the medical professionals she had inspired. In October 2024, the Rosen family received a commendation from the Baltimore Police Department, recognizing their patience and cooperation during the decades-long investigation. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by family members and the investigators who had worked on the case. Police Commissioner Sarah Davis presented the commendation to Margaret Rosen, praising the family's trust in the justice system even when that system seemed to have failed them. Your family never gave up hope that someday we would find Dr. Rosen's killer, Commissioner Davis said. Your faith in our ability to seek justice, even after 55 years, helped sustain this investigation through its darkest moments. The commendation letter acknowledged the family's suffering and the long wait for answers, while praising their cooperation with multiple generations of investigators who had worked the case. Detective Morrison, the original investigator who had retired 39 years earlier, attended the ceremony in a wheelchair. At 92 years old, he had lived to see the case that had haunted his career finally resolved. I promised Dr. Rosen we'd find her killer, Morrison said, his voice shaky but determined. It took longer than any of us expected, but we kept that promise. The DNA evidence from Carol's fingernails was formally preserved for future study, becoming part of a growing collection of genetic material that might help solve other cold cases or contribute to forensic science research. Margaret Rosen accepted the commendation on behalf of her entire family, including relatives who had died during the long wait for answers. The ceremony provided official recognition of their ordeal and acknowledgement that their suffering had not been forgotten. Social media responses to news coverage of the ceremony were overwhelmingly supportive of the family and the investigators who had persevered through decades of uncertainty. The public seemed to understand that justice, even when delayed, still had meaning and value. Justice never forgets became an unofficial motto for the case, appearing in news headlines and social media posts about the investigation. The phrase captured the idea that some crimes transcend time and that truth eventually emerges despite efforts to hide it. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for Carol and all victims of unsolved crimes. The gesture acknowledged that while her case had been resolved, the work of seeking justice for forgotten victims would continue. As family members and investigators left the police station, they carried with them the satisfaction of a job completed and a promise kept, even though that completion had taken more than half a century to achieve. The story of Dr. Carol Rosen reached its conclusion on a quiet December evening in 2024 as snow fell gently on the Baltimore streets, where she had once walked to and from the hospital. Her case had become a symbol of both the long reach of justice and the enduring power of scientific advancement to illuminate truth. In the pediatric ward at University of Maryland Hospital, nurses continued the tradition Carol had started, staying late to comfort frightened children and their families. Her influence lived on in the compassionate care provided by medical professionals who had learned her story and embraced her example. The memorial plaque in the hospital hallway had become a pilgrimage site for medical students and residents who drew inspiration from Carol's dedication to healing. The words, "Her light endures," served as a reminder that some legacies transcend individual lives and continue inspiring others across generations. Margaret Rosen, now approaching her 80th birthday, found peace in knowing that her sister's killer had been identified and that Carol's story had helped advance the science of criminal investigation. The answers had come too late for perfect justice, but they had come. Detective Garner moved on to other cold cases, using the techniques perfected in Carol's investigation to bring answers to other families who had waited years for closure. Each success built on lessons learned from the Rosen case, creating a legacy of scientific investigation that honored Carol's memory. The genetic genealogy database that had led to McArthur's identification continued growing as more people uploaded their DNA for family research. Each new profile increased the likelihood that other cold cases could be solved, extending Carol's inadvertent contribution to criminal justice. In research laboratories across the country, forensic scientists studied the Rosen case as a model for using genetic genealogy to solve decades-old crimes. Academic papers and training manuals ensured that her case would teach future investigators how to pursue justice even when traditional methods failed. 6 months after the case's resolution, another cold case was solved using techniques pioneered in Carol's investigation. A 1985 murder in Virginia was traced to a suspect through genetic genealogy, providing another family with long-sought answers and demonstrating the ongoing value of the scientific advances Carol's case had helped establish. The Baltimore skyline sparkled with lights as evening settled over the city where Carol had lived, worked, and died. Her apartment building had been demolished decades earlier, replaced by a small park where children played under trees that had grown tall in the 55 years since her death. But in the hospital where she had devoted herself to healing children, her presence remained. Student doctors still learned about her dedication, her compassion, and her tragic death. Her story continued, teaching new generations about both the nobility of medicine and the importance of never giving up on justice. As 2024 drew to a close, newspaper editors writing year-end retrospectives included the Rosen case among the year's most significant events. Justice Never Forgets headlines reminded readers that some stories transcend time and that truth, no matter how long delayed, still has the power to heal. The camera of history panned slowly across the hospital hallway, where Carol's memorial plaque caught the last light of day. The words, "Her light endures," seemed to glow with their own illumination, a promise that her dedication to healing would continue inspiring others long after her story had been told and her killer identified. In memory and in method, in the children saved by doctors she had inspired, and the cases solved by techniques her investigation had advanced, Dr. Carol Rosen's light indeed endured, burning bright against the darkness of violence, and illuminating the path toward justice for all who had been forgotten. Her story was complete, but her legacy was just beginning.